thank you so much for joining us. We're absolutely honoured to have you with us on our community. And I've seen that you've been joining in with your fellow pro engineer friends as well.
Yeah.
Messaging everybody. It's so good. And thank you so much for.
We were just talking about that as before we came on. I mean, the connectivity now and being able to talk to your friends and meet other people who are like-minded, who do what we all do, is phenomenal these days. Yeah. I mean, I speak to, the first 25, 30 years of my career, I don't think, apart from my good friend Chris Sheldon, who, I've grown up with him, so we kept in touch, but meeting other engineers and producers was always challenging and finding out what they're up to. But now, of course, it's incredible.
It's so crazy, isn't it? Now it's so good. Let's start from the beginning then, if that's okay with you, Tim. Let's have a chat about your journey and your incredible discography as well. So, where did you grow up, and what type of music were your parents into? What type of music did they raise you on?
Well, I'm actually, although my accent doesn't seem that way, I'm actually a Geordie.
Oh wow, okay.
I was born in Whitley Bay. And I spent the first 9 years of my life in just outside Newcastle, and it was great. I loved it. And funnily enough, one of the first memories I have that really was about music, that really changed the way I thought about music, was actually at school when I was in Newcastle. Was our music teacher one day, we thought he was just reading a poem, and he read us the words to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which was probably not that old at that time, of course, because I was born in 62. So it was probably a relatively contemporary piece of work. But he read the poem, and we all listened to it. And then he said, right, now listen to this. And he put the record down, and the needle went down. And suddenly the whole thing to me became three-dimensional and came to life. And, and that was the moment, or one of the first moments, when I remember the power of how much the music took the words to another place, and that was pretty stunning. But my father worked in television. My father was a director and a producer at Tyne-Tees Television. So another early sort of memory was that my dad left to go to the World Cup in Mexico in 1970. And he went away from home for a long time, and I missed my dad. And when he came back, he brought all these gifts from Mexico and stuff like that. And for himself, he brought back a few albums, and he brought back a couple of albums from Sergio Mendes. And when I used to come home from school, I'd be going through Dad's records and stuff. And I really remember the Sergio Mendes records, because at the time, Mum and Dad's music was the music of the 60s, and particularly the music of the 50s. So that's my first taste of getting into music, was literally playing their records, as it is for so many of us, and hearing the music around our home, hearing the radio, which was so incredible to be able to listen to Radio 1 and stuff like that, which was so varied, not like it is in America, where it's very genre specific. And then the real wake up call, the let's do it moment, was with punk rock, when I was further later in my life, when I was down in London, and my mates started to listen to punk music, and I went round to my mate's house, and he played me the Sex Pistols single, and everything came to life for me at that point. And
so good.
Very fortunate to go and see bands like The Damned and The Clash and The Jam and the Ramones, all those sort of bands. It was phenomenal, and that was my first. And then, of course, you had to form a band, right? So I'll play guitar. So I got a guitar, figured out how to play a bar chord, and we had a band. And next thing you're in doing a demo, and that's probably the first taste of when I saw somebody recording, was the demo that we made. But briefly, that's my musical upbringing.
So cool. So you were a punk. Were you into the new wave scene as well?
Of course, I followed on from that, but I got into, once the punk thing happened, and I started listening to music and playing in bands towards the end of my school. It wasn't that long before I was making cups of tea in the studio, so everything changed very, very fast.
How did that come about then? So, like you said, so you're in a punk band with a few friends, and then next minute you're in a studio. So how did that transition happen?
Well, I mean, basically, when we made our demos, that was the sort of light bulb moment where I saw this guy working the board, and I was trying to play these guitar parts, and I suggested a couple of ideas, and he said, well, maybe you could play the same guitar part up an octave, and I'll put some delay on it. And I played this part, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic the way this comes together.
Yeah.
It's like an audio jigsaw puzzle. I love it. And that was when I first got a taste of like how much I liked this. But of course, the idea of ever getting a job doing it wasn't really something I thought about. And finished my A levels and was not accepted to university, and started to wonder about what exactly I was going to do. And my father told me that at one of his shows that he was working on, because he worked for Thames Television at that time, he said, "Hey, I must tell you, a record producer is coming to one of our shows." And I said, "Oh, right." And he said, "Yeah, he's a guy called Phil Wayman." And I didn't know Phil at the time. Of course, I do now. But I went to this to meet Phil at my dad's show, and Phil basically said to me, "Do you want to come and have a look at my studio up in North London?" And of course, I said, "I'd love to come and look at your studio, Phil." And I went up with my dad one night, and Phil gave us the old tour of Utopia. And it was just mind blowing to me. I mean, it was a real professional studio, and Phil was a legendary 70s producer. I mean, he looked and he was the part. You know, he had the Rolls Royce, he had the big office with all the discs on the wall, and you know, he showed me around. And at the end of the tour, I said to Phil, I said, "You know, how do you get a job working in a place like this?" And well, basically, if you ever consider working in a studio like this, you basically start by sweeping the floors, making the tea, and you know, work your way up. But you know, we're busy. We've got a full staff at the minute. But if you want to put your name down on the list, then I'll give you a call if there's ever the opportunity for a new tea boy. So I said I would absolutely like to be on that list, and I put my name down and waited for quite a few months. But eventually, the phone rang, and I had the opportunity to go up and have an interview, and I got the job as the new tea boy.
So good. It's a right place at the right time, then.
Absolutely. I'm grateful that I had that opportunity. As you know, we were talking about one of your chat groups the other day, the combination of opportunity and ability constantly come up in this business, you know, not only to get a break, but also when you're getting a gig. You know, you might know somebody in a band, and eventually you get the opportunity, but you've still got to come through. That was the opportunity for me, and yeah, I loved it. I loved being an assistant. It was a great way. It was an apprenticeship, you know, unlike nowadays where you can go to school. There wasn't really schools then. You started as an apprentice and you learned by watching other people. At that time, the way the music industry was, studios were a massive pull, a massive draw to artists because of the quality of the studio itself, and also because of the engineering staff. This was sort of before outside engineers. The idea of bringing your own engineer to a session wasn't really happening very often when I first started at Utopia. This happened much later. And people would book into studios because of the high quality and the history that the engineers had with making great records. And being part of a studio like Utopia gave me an opportunity to, you know, jump in on that. And the cutting crew was an opportunity where it was a new band coming in. The studio booking lady, Annie, said, "Look, we've got a mixing session coming into the remix room. Do you think you can manage the remix room okay?" And I said, I'm ready. I can do it. So I was put on the session as the engineer. And fortunately for me, I was able to get my hands on a song as well crafted as I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight. And I spent a couple of days mixing that, and the rest is history. Opportunities like that don't happen too often these days.
No.
But the other massive break that I had was I was assisting, literally the assistant engineer on the Kajagoogoo record in 1980, whatever it was, 3 or 2.
Yeah.
And I used to assist a lot for Colin Thurston, who was the producer and engineer. And Colin was known for his work with Howard Jones and Duran Duran, and he'd also been an engineer on the Heroes album, I think, for David Bowie. So I was happy to sit next to Colin, and he would let me mic the drums up occasionally, and I loved working with Colin. And on the Kajagoogoo record, he was co-producing with Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran. So they would work through the day, and when it got to about 7, I could tell that Nick Rhodes and Colin were itchy to go home. And they said at one point, "Look, do you think we could leave the session with Tim? He can record these guitars with you, and Nick and I will check in the morning." So I jumped at that, and it was a great opportunity for me. And I did a lot of recording with the band in the evenings, and Colin and Nick would check everything in the morning. So that went well. And when the album was finished, of course, back in those days, I don't know how many people remember B-sides, but when you had a single,
I do.
You had to have a
Yep.
B-side, right?
Yep.
And the record company said, we need a couple of B-sides for the singles. And of course,
Mm.
once again, Colin and Nick were not too excited about the idea of doing the B-sides. So they said, why don't you just do the B-sides with Tim, young Tim? And I was like, ready to go. So I asked the manager for a little demo that they had for the songs we were going to record. And we recorded over a couple of weekends. And
Yeah.
I listed a few things to how I thought it should be. And at the end of the session, I asked the manager, I said, look, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I feel that I've sort of contributed quite a lot to these songs. Would you give me a co-production? And he said, of course we will. You
Yeah.
deserve it. And that's fine, because you always have to ask. If you don't ask, you don't get. So I asked him and I got it. And then what happened was the label loved them and put one of the songs, which was an instrumental track called Kajagoogoo, onto the album. So I'd started as an assistant on the album and ended up co-producing one song on the album. So I got my first gold disc. And later, I think it's John Hughes, used that piece of music as the intro to 16 Candles, his movie. So it became quite a big song in America as well, that instrumental. But once again, who knew? How would we guess these things?
Yeah, so I watched an interview with you recently, and I understand you've only just been made aware about the 16 Candles
Yeah,
thing. Is that a recent event?
I had no idea.
Absolutely incredible. So cool. Right, so let's next step of your journey. So you've worked with Kajagoogoo, you've also worked with Cutting Crew as well, and Robert Plant happens. So tell me the story behind Robert and his new album. As I know that obviously in the 70s, Led Zeppelin were the definitive rock band, hard rock band, and Robert was going solo. So what sound was he after, and how did the whole process begin?
Well, again, very fortunate on my behalf, because Robert, obviously being in Led Zeppelin, had made incredible rock sounding records and made fabulous albums. And he'd reached a point in his solo career, he'd put a couple of solo records out already.
Yeah.
And he's always, wanting to move on. He doesn't rest on his laurels, Robert Plant. He's very eclectic in his taste. And he was listening to a lot of the music in the 80s and decided that he wanted to incorporate some more of the modern technology into his work. And I had been working a lot with bands like Kajagoogoo, for example, and I worked with Dead or Alive. I engineered their first record when Wayne Hussey was still in the band, and I worked with a producer called Zoyce B. Held. We worked on Fashion, and we worked with John Fox and all sorts of stuff like that. So I was sort of heavily into the sort of more electronic aspect of pop music at that time. And Robert was looking for someone who he actually thought understood that side of making records. So my manager called me up and said, hey, Robert Plant's looking for an engineer. I've put your name down. And Robert called me up one day on a session, which was pretty shocking. And I ended up getting the gig to be the engineer and co-producer on an album called Shaken Not Stirred. And later we did Now and Zen, but that was my first entry point working with Robert. And coming from the 80s, where most sessions were about, okay, here come the band, here comes the Lindrum, here comes the sequencers, a lot of plugging in, a lot of DI boxes. Sure. I wasn't actually that well versed on recording live bands. So working with Robert with a full band, including Richie Hayward from Little Feat, and guitar player, bass player, Robert singing live, everyone in the room at the same time, everyone wanted a different headphone balance, Marcus Studios, Harrison board that I've never worked on. I was sort of thrown in incredibly in the deep end.
Yeah.
And I almost blew it. I was struggling, I'll be honest, with.
Oh wow. Okay.
It was a lot for me. And luckily for me, I was working alongside Robert, and I was working alongside a co-producer called Benji Lefebvre, who was Robert's live sound engineer, and he had a lot more experience in recording live bands than I did. So luckily for me, I managed to make my way through, although, as I said, it got a bit sketchy at times. Robert went and complained to the studio owners, saying that, the studio's messing up and we're not getting things done quick enough. And the owner of Marcus said, it's not the studio, it's that young kid you've got running the studio. And luckily for me, I was getting on pretty well with Robert at the time, so he didn't pay much credence to that. And I was able to continue. But in the end, we made a pretty great record. And what happened for me out of that, of course, was that I didn't want to make pop records necessarily, or records that were with, you know, sequencers and all the modern technology. I wanted to work with bands. As I said, I'd come from punk rock and come from the new wave background. So this working with somebody like Robert Plant gave me the credibility then to be able to go to a band and say, I can now work with you guys. And after working with Robert, I was able to do a lot of guitar bands, and that's when I really started to come into my own, to be honest.
Fantastic. So good. I know, before we move on, I remember watching an interview with you a couple of days ago where you mentioned that Robert, he put a pile of CDs on your desk, if that's right, a sort of Led Zeppelin, no, not CDs at the time, maybe vinyl, I'm guessing at the time, where apparently you only knew Stairway to Heaven when you first started working with him. Is that right? Is that a true story?
Yeah, it's true. What happened was we were setting up drums and Robert kept on making reference points to classic Zeppelin songs. And as I pointed out, coming from a punk background, at school, the kids who were into Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, honestly, were the guys who would sit there for hours doing their homework. They were the SWATs, as we call them. And we weren't interested in any of that crap. We were listening to the punk records. We were trying to get, you know, the new Ruts album on the turntable. So we didn't have time for Zeppelin. So when I got a job in the studio, I had very little knowledge of the Led Zeppelin catalog, and he kept on making these reference points up, Misty Mountain Hop or When the Levee Breaks, and he actually could sense that I wasn't too sure, and he said, do you know these songs? And I said, I'll be honest, I don't. And he said, what kind of music do you like? And we both agreed that we thought that the drum sound on New Rose from The Damned was incredible. So we had and we laughed about that, and that's when he brought the next day, put the records down and said, you should check my old band out. I think you'll like them. And it's a true story. But Robert's great. He certainly pushes your buttons and gets he really brings everything that he can out of every music. It was a great record to be part of. In fact, when we did the Now and Zen album, which was later, it was about 1988. It was the first time that he got Jimmy to come, and Jimmy came by and played with Robert for the first time since Zeppelin, and I was lucky enough to be the guy recording that. And Jimmy turns up to the studio, and suddenly I have 2 assistants and 2 maintenance guys and a couple of other people working in the studio that day. Everyone suddenly was available when Jimmy turns up, right? That was pretty special.
So how did that opportunity come about, and that particular project with David Bowie?
That was, once again, pretty outrageous that came out of the blue like that. I mean, I'd worked at that point with The Mission. I'd worked with the House of Love, James, you know, lots of guitar bands. And David was working with Reeves Gabrels at that point. They were doing demos for their latest, you know, work that they were. It was a new project that they were basically working on, and they were looking for somebody to engineer and work with them on the project. And Reeves had reached out to Billy Duffy and a couple of other people, and Billy, apparently, I didn't know this till many years later, but Billy said that, you know, you should give Tim Palmer a look. And Reeves knew a lot of the records I'd done as well, so suddenly my name was in the hat, as it were, to work on the record. And I got a phone call from David Bowie in my apartment. Of course, it didn't come out of the blue. You get a phone call from the management first saying, please stay in your apartment. David Bowie's going to call in about 20 minutes. And I sat there shaking before the call. But it was a wonderful opportunity for me. Basically, David was at that point, as you know, he was constantly shedding skins of different images and different directions musically. And his particular skin of being the 80s pop star had been a particularly uncomfortable one for him to wear. He was beginning to make music make the music for the masses in a way, and it wasn't really very comfortable, and it wasn't rubbing well with him. So Tin Machine was the opportunity for David to, you know, find a way out of that, and it provided an escape for him to be able to go back to being as creative and have fun with recording music again. And I was very fortunate enough to be the guy who was picked to record Tin Machine, and we worked in mountain studios in Switzerland, and it was chaotic, it was live, it was unrehearsed, and It was challenging, but it was a lot of fun. And I really think that a lot of that music has been very overlooked. I mean, there's some wonderful songs on the
Yeah.
two first Tin Machine records, and
Yeah.
I'm still very good friends with Reeves Gabrels. I play his guitars. The orange one behind me is a Reeves Gabrels Reverend guitar, and we're good mates to this day. He helps me a lot when I'm, doing work for Music Cares through the Academy to help musicians and raise money. And Reeves
Brilliant.
stayed friends for years, and it was an incredible opportunity, and so much that I could learn from being in the room with musicians of that caliber. Hunt and Tony being from Iggy Pop's band, and
Wow.
the rhythm section of Lust for Life, and
Yeah.
also there was another guitar player called Kevin Armstrong, who's an incredible guitar player, and he was a real backbone to a lot of those songs. And the counterpart to Reeves being able to be as crazy as he was, you've got Kevin holding the whole thing down. And of course, then I get to work with David Bowie as well. And, how invaluable is that?
So the early 90s, Pearl Jam.
Yeah.
So I know that you started working on 10. So tell us the story behind 10, and it eventually ended up selling over 14 million copies. And how did the mix session come about? I understand that the guys from Pearl Jam came across to the UK. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that album's just been inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame this year, actually, which is
Wow.
great. Yeah, that was a very special record for me. I'd worked with half of the band before in a band called Mother Love Bone. I mixed
Yeah.
that album in LA, and I'd mixed that album solo. I hadn't had any of the band around me, so I hadn't, got a relationship with the musicians at all. We spoke on the phone, and as I said, I mixed that record. But when, unfortunately, very sadly, the singer of Mother Love Bone died
Yeah.
at the time of the release of the record. Of course, that whole thing fell to pieces. And out of the ashes of Mother Love Bone, Pearl Jam was formed. And when they were looking for somebody to mix their record, I was lucky enough to be considered. And when I was in LA, I'd been in LA for a long time, producing a band called Neverland for Jimmy Iovine.
Yeah.
And they asked me if I would have a meeting. So we went to see the Lakers play, which was fun. And I got to meet the band, and we all got on pretty well. They said, well, would you do a test song for us just to make sure that we're happy with the way everything's going? So I mixed the song once at A&M Studios, and it came out pretty great, and they were happy. And next thing I know, I've got the opportunity to mix the record. So that was good. Bear all this in mind, of course, this was just a brand new band out of Seattle that I hadn't heard of. They were certainly not a major, big band at that point at all. They were brand new. And I was able, because of that, I was able to say, look, I don't want to mix the record in America. I need to go home. I need to be back at home for a while because I've been away too long. And
Sure.
I loved working at Ridge Farm. I'd recorded the Mission first album at Ridge Farm. I mixed some of the Tin Machine stuff there. I'd worked at Ridge Farm a lot, and I loved the vibe. And it was also about 40 minutes from where I lived in Surrey.
Yeah.
So they agreed that they would fly the whole band, not like nowadays, right, where everyone's trying to save as much money as possible. They flew the whole band in, and they all stayed at Ridge Farm Studios, and all the tapes were flown in, and we just got on with it, and we made this record in about 2 weeks at Ridge Farm, and it was great. I mean, they hadn't quite finished everything. Most of the recording was done. Things like on a live, for instance, Mike said, "Oh, I need to put a solo on at the end," and I said, "Okay, no problem." So he set his mic up, amp up in the
Yeah.
live, and we put a solo together. The first time we played the solo one live, I remember we did about 4 takes, and I pieced together what I thought was the best take, and it sounded pretty great. And I took a cassette home and or a CD, I guess it was at that time, but I listened to it at home and I liked it. But when I came in, the band said, "Look, we don't feel very comfortable with the fact that it's been pieced together. We'd like to have another shot at it where, now he knows the song and he's got what he's going to do. Mike wants to just try and get one in one pass." And that's exactly what he did. And
Wow.
sort of the feeling that we had about the record was it wasn't about, putting together in pieces. It was very much a performance.
Yeah.
Eddie did a few backing vocals, and it was just a great experience. I mean, they came in I was going home. They stayed at at Ridge Farm at the premises, and we ate dinner together.
Wow.
But I would go home at night, take a DAT or a CD or whatever it was, listen to the mix, make my notes, play it for the band in the morning. They would tell me if there was anything they weren't happy with. and if once we were done, print it, move on. And it was a low pressure, probably 14-day project, and it's just incredible to me that it's still there in the top 20 on iTunes in alternative music every single week pretty much.
It's crazy. Okay, I'll tell you a very quick story just to add to what you're saying, Tim. I started playing guitar when I was 11, so I'm 37 now. And my French teacher at school actually gave me a mixtape. And he said, my son suggested a band that you should check out. I know you're into your rock music. And it had Pearl Jam 10 on one side and Versus on the other. And it was just absolutely blew my mind. But going back even further, my parents were actually quite strict when it came to music and swear words and all that sort of stuff. And my dad said, no, you're not having that Pearl Jam album. I'm sorry, I know you like the look of it, but you're not having it. And my guitar teacher, right, actually like sat me down with a tab book, and I was flicking through his book going, I want to learn this Pearl Jam song. I want to learn this Nirvana song. I've heard about these bands. I've never heard their music. So I actually learned to play these songs before I ever heard them. And
that's crazy.
It's so good. But then eventually, I went out and bought 10 on tape and just played it to death, like a lot of kids back then in the 90s. And just huge Pearl Jam fan. But yeah, it's crazy. But yeah, a lot of the bands, like Green Day as well. I never listened to Green Day. I actually learned to play Green Day on Dookie on guitar. Most of the songs on Dookie before I even actually heard it. So and I was obsessed ever since. But with Pearl Jam as well. So very quick before we move on, what were the guys like back then? Were they very unassuming? Did they have like a rock star vibe to them, or were they just like some very down to earth guys that were just making an album?
They were. That's exactly what it was. They were very unassuming. Eddie was a little more intense than the rest of the guys, but they were super sweet and easy to work with. I remember Eddie would be concerned sometimes to make sure that certain lyrics were not too present and were more suggested, and he more into that sort of thing. But they were great, and we got on really well. The thing about making records, as you know, is this thing about opportunity and ability and stuff like that. Well,
yeah.
Also, there's you make mistakes and you make decisions that don't really necessarily work out to be the right one, or maybe that's the reason. But when I finished that record, we got on great. I found a postcard actually a couple of days ago that I got from the band, and how much fun they've had making 10, and how we can't wait for you to produce our second album. And I thought, I forgot about that, but I didn't really forget about it, of course. What happened was that at the end of that, we'd agreed to work on a couple of songs together on a movie called Singles. I don't know if you remember that movie.
Yeah, I do.
That featured a lot of the bands from Seattle. So I agreed to fly to Seattle and produce Pearl Jam, the two songs. And there was also a cut from a track I mixed for Mother Love Bone on that album. And anyway, in the meantime, I get a phone call from Dave Bates at Phonogram, and he says, I really want you to produce the new Tears for Fears album. Okay. So this was a band at that point. Tears for Fears were one of the biggest bands in the world.
Yeah.
And an incredible opportunity for me. And at that time, Pearl Jam weren't one of the biggest bands in the world. So I basically blew them off, really. I mean, we called and said, look, I'm sorry, but Tim's not going to be able, my manager called and said, Tim's not going to be able to come to record these songs because he's starting an album with Tears for Fears, and tried to be dramatic. And they didn't really take too kindly to it, and were a little bit upset about it. And they got in somebody else to produce their music. And of course, the rest is history. I never worked with a band again. But that's the way it goes. You take chances. That's what's going to happen. And I loved my time working with Roland and Tears for Fears, so I don't regret it by any means, but it is an interesting one, because I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone across to cut those tracks. Maybe they would have hated what I did. Maybe I'd never have worked with them after that anyway, but I blew my opportunity to produce Pearl Jam by doing something else.
Well, I suppose, but like you said, though, because if you're booked up, aren't you? At the end of the day, it's just the way I'm guessing that it goes in the industry from time to time.
That's true. But when you're booked up and then you blow somebody off to do something else, that's when it hurts as an artist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another funny thing, we could talk forever, but another funny thing that's great is that when I started to work with Roland from Tears for Fears, he was really into astrology. So before
Okay.
we started the record, he asked for my star signs and where I was born, the time I was born, etc., because he wanted to put our charts on
Yeah.
top of each other to see whether we'd work together. So he did the charts and he called me back and he said, "I think that you and I we're gonna get work great together." And as it happens, we do, and we're still good mates, Roland and I. And
Fantastic.
I did some mixes for them recently. Actually, we're still very much in touch. But he saw this on the star chart and he said to me, he said, "There's something in your chart I think you should be aware of." And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "Well, I'll be honest." He said, "It looks like you might make quite a lot of money coming up relatively soon." So the two of us sort of thought, "Oh, I work with Tears for Fears. Tears for Fears does well. I make a decent amount of cash. Lovely." How nice. And anyway, so we start making this record in Bath at Roland Studio. And
Yeah.
every day I would go, every week I would drive into Bath, pick up Billboard. And I
Yeah.
remember saying to Mark O'Donoghue, who's my engineer, I said to Mark, "Hey, look, remember that band I did at Ridge Farm, Pearl Jam? It's at number 196 on the Billboard chart." I said, "Oh, that's pretty cool." And then a couple of weeks carries on because Tears for Fears records take a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Weeks in, I said, "Hey, Mark, you know the band?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "It's at number 110 now." And he said, "Oh, that's great." And we kept going. And by the end of the Tears for Fears record, there it was in the charts at number 2.
No way.
I was there for weeks. And that was the band that had just blown off.
Oh, gutted. Absolutely gutted. But hey, when we were about to talk about the rest of your discography, it
Okay.
kind of worked out all right, didn't it?
Yeah.
It kind of it kind of went well.
By any means.
Absolutely. So yeah, let's talk about the 90s. So Pearl Jam was 90, 91, is that right? When you were in
Yeah.
the studio?
So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then, so you're working with bands as diverse as Texas. Like you said, you mentioned that you started working with them in the 80s. Catherine Wheel, one of my favorite bands.
Yeah.
Ocean Colour Scene. Then even as diverse as bands like ska bands like Real Big Fish. And
Yeah.
then he started going towards the Goldfinger, and then in the early noughties towards MXPX. So with the 90s, what were some of the highlights to you from your back catalogue in the 90s?
Oh, the 90s was great. It was a good time. The music industry was still flushed with cash, so there were good budgets to make records.
Yeah.
It was a good time, good studios, a lot of fun. I really enjoyed. I mixed a band called Sponge from Detroit. I love the records we made together.
Oh
Sponge,
yeah, great band.
the Missions Carved in Sand was, I think, in 90. That began the 90s with Carved in Sand,
Yeah.
and I'm still very close with Wayne Hussey. We made a record very recently, and we also did
Fantastic.
Terror of Strength. I did one record I'm very proud of. The sound of is a record called Babe Rainbow by the House of Love that I didn't produce. It was produced by Warren Livesey, but I'd always been a fan of Warren's productions. I mean, immaculate. And as far as mixing, it was a joy. So that record sounded great. I mean, sometimes as a mixing engineer, as you know, nobody knows as a mixing engineer whether you took a project from a sort of 30% rating to a 90, or whether you actually took it from a 90 to a 95.
Yeah.
Nobody knows. So sometimes you can get a lot of credit for something that was already great. That is a good example of that. Babe Rainbow. I mean, it was a joy to mix. Another record like that for me was when I did Absentia for Porcupine Tree. That was very well produced, and it was a joy to mix that as well. So it was taking up the last few percent. Other records you do, you're bringing it up a lot, and you can add a lot to it. But those records. Sure. Particularly, I did a record with called Concrete Blonde that a lot of people are not aware of. Called is it called Mexican Moon? I love that. Record. The Mother Love Bone was also in that period. I did a record with Johnny Marr. I mixed a record with Johnny Marr, a band from Manchester called Marion, which really went under the radar, and that was a pretty fun project to work on because I was always a fan of Johnny Marr and getting to show me how to play some of those riffs was always nice. I did a record with Gene Loves Jezebel, and I love doing that. And there was a single on that went to number 1 in the alternative charts in America. So that was a fun project. But, I mean, there's so many. I could just go on and bore you all to tears with the fun I had in the 90s. It was just a great time.
So good. I'm a Nottingham lad originally, but I've in the last 5 years moved across to Manchester. But I decided to look at, like you're talking about Johnny Marr, decided to start discovering the Manchester scene and the music that happened over the 80s and 90s, and some of the music that was coming out from the Smiths, for example. It's just absolutely fantastic. So moving on. So this takes us to the 2000s, so to the noughties, and you started working with U2 on All That You Can't Leave Behind,
Yeah.
which it. I loved U2 in the 80s. Again, talking about my family, but my dad, massive U2 fan, really into bands like U2 and The Alarm in the 80s. And he got me into Joshua Tree, one of my favorite albums. And then that transitioned to the 90s into, I'm trying to remember the albums, but Discotheque as well. Am I right in saying that in the late 90s? Was it? Yeah. Yeah. And then U2 decided to go back, not back, but they decided to evolve their sound, if you agree, between their 80s vibe of The Edge's amazing anthemic delayed guitar sounds with a U2 that is probably, I would say, if you agree, the U2 that we now know. And with that, I'm guessing that was a big decision from what I understand, though, with The Edge. He was wanting to use some of those sounds on the new songs. So
Right.
how did it all come about? I could ask you so many questions about this, Tim. But how did it come about? You working with U2, working with people like Brian Eno on the project, and also where was it and who was involved with you at the time?
Well, I tell you how it happened. It's a funny story again. Always are, right?
Brilliant.
I was mixing. I was asked after Michael Hutchence died. They put out his solo album that he'd been working on, and I was asked if I would mix a couple of songs from the Michael Hutchence solo record. And my manager, who is still my manager, Sandy Robertson from World's End Management, said in typical Sandy fashion, he says, "Look, mix these songs, make a great job of them. Bono sings as a guest on one of them. He'll love it, and you'll be mixing on the new U2 album." And I was, yeah, right, okay. So I went off to work on these mixes with for the Michael Hutchence record, and it came out pretty great. And Bono called the studio and said, "I've heard the mix that you did of the song that I'm on, and I want to thank you so much because I was so worried about it, and it sounds so great now. Thank you for what you did." And I was quite gobsmacked and said, "Okay, great." And he said, "I'll be back in touch because I have a song I'd like you to mix." So he went away, and the next thing I knew, I was asked to mix a song called "The Ground Beneath Her Feet," which is on the UK release of that album, I think.
Yeah.
But it was from a movie called The $1 Million Hotel. And I went over to London because I was living in LA at the time, and I mixed the song at Olympic completely on my own. And on the way to the studio, I knew that the tapes had arrived, and Bono called my cell phone and said, "I've got a real problem with the drums on this particular song." And not wanting to look like I didn't quite understand, I just went along with this and said, "Oh, okay." He said, "Could you do something with the drums?" And he was quite vague, but I said, "Sure, yeah, of course. I know exactly what you mean." Didn't know what he was talking about. So I get to the studio and I start unraveling what they'd done. And I figured that the first part of the song was all programmed with a sequencer and drum machine. It was pretty cool, but that was what he was not happy with. So I thought, well, what am I going to do? And I thought, okay, well, I think I know what I want to do, but will the band go for it or not? And in those situations, when you're a mixing engineer, you sort of got to follow your gut and just go for it. It's either going to work out or it's not. And so I rang up a drum rental place and said, "I need a snare drum, some cymbals." And I got some brushes, and I thought, okay, I'll replace the program drums with a sort of Walk on the Wild Side, Lou Reed type of feel. So I made a loop, just out of a brushes feel, looped it up, added some cymbals, and basically cut between the groove of the loop back to the electronic drums. So it had this back and forth feeling. And then at the end, Larry comes in on the full drum kit, and that's fine at that point. And I worked, and it was a long night. It was one of the days of, long studio sessions. I worked all night, finished printed all the mixes, sent it off, and it could have gone two ways. They could have gone, who the fuck is this guy playing drums for U2? Or they're going to like it. And
Yep.
they said, sounds great. And they never even mentioned where did those drums come from. It was just like, that was it. So they said, great. And I was told at that point that, we'd love you to do some mixing for our new album. And I said, of course, I'd love to. And I just waited because this was, before social media and everyone being so fast with emails. And I remember waiting a long time before I finally got a phone call from The Edge, who said, I'm sending over a couple of songs to LA for you to start working on. And I started working on Stuck in a Moment and
Wow.
Beautiful Day, I think.
Yep.
And I started doing a lot of preliminary mixing on those songs in Larrabee Studios in LA and sent them off what I'd done. And as is often the case with U2, it's not as simple as just mixing a song and it be done.
Yeah.
They don't leave any stone unturned. On one hand, they're the hardest working band in rock and roll. On the other hand, they can be very boring, and it's just like pulling teeth because they have the budget to be able to say, well, what about if we got Mike Hedges to mix this intro, and what about if we got Steve Lillywhite to read? They'll try anything.
That's
And
crazy.
one hand, that's wonderful that they put so much love into their art.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when you're sitting there for days trying to make progress, it's quite frustrating. Anyway, so I took the songs to a certain level, and then they asked me to come to Dublin and join the team and continue working in Dublin. So I did many, many, many hours working with the band in Dublin on the mixing of that record, and it was exciting, and the music was great, but it was certainly hard work, that's for sure.
That's so good. A Beautiful Day, it became one of U2's biggest songs.
Yeah.
Well, it's it's like, if you, for example, I suppose for the generation now that tends to go on Spotify, they look at bands' top 5 songs, and it's on there. It's with over, I think, 200 million plays. Something crazy.
It's interesting with U2. The way that they credit things is, if you're the last man on the chain to finish the song, you get the credit. And I was the last man on Elevation, for instance. I inherited some pretty cool stuff in the middle section from some other mixing engineer who didn't get the final credit. So you win some, you lose some, So when you finish a mix for U2, they want you to print everything that you've done. So if you come up with some crazy delay or distortion, that goes on and that's passed on. You pass the baton onto the next guy. And Lillywhite mixed Beautiful Day and did a wonderful job with it. I mean, it's a classic U2 song. And I passed the baton I did at least 2 weeks mixing with Steve and without Steve on that song, but he finished the job. And on other songs, I finished New York, I finished Stuck in a Moment. I did pretty much all of that. Elevation, I inherited quite a lot of stuff. But yeah, it was a great opportunity, and it's very interesting to be part of that whole vibe,
So good. Am I right in saying that you actually met Bono in the 80s when you were at a Tin Machine gig? Am I right?
Yeah. I met him at I went to see the Tin Machine show at the Town and Country, I think, and there was the usual VIP little square off area by the soundboard, and I met him at that gig, and he reminded me of that actually when I finally got to meet him. But that's when I first met Bono. But yeah, Bono was great. I mean, their whole band were great. They were very nice to work with, as I said, but they really work hard. And they're sort of the opposite. David Bowie would sort of taught me, as I watched the way he worked, to leave things alone sometimes, let it go. Sometimes the little things that are mistakes are actually the best part of the recording. With U2, they weren't into leaving things alone. They'll keep fucking adding overdubs, even in mastering. They're still adding. And sometimes that's great, but sometimes it's not. I mean, but it's the way it goes. It's just a different way of working.
Absolutely. So let's move on to So I was thinking about maybe we have a chat about. Forgive me, am I pronouncing this correctly? Is it Wylde Bello?
Yeah,
Wylde. Wylde. Sorry, Wylde from him. My other half's going to kill me for this because she was a huge him fan back in the day. She's even got a heartogram tattoo as well. So,
Really?
yeah,
Excellent.
she has indeed. Yeah, so before we talk about that, let's have a chat about Ozzy. So you started writing with Ozzy and producing with him and recording. So I'm guessing maybe was Ozzy out of his mad phase and more of a chilled Ozzy Osbourne was he at that moment in time, or was he very focused on what he wanted to do at that moment in time?
He was focused on the fact that he didn't want to make a record. Yeah, that's for sure. He didn't really want to do it. He'd worked
Really?
on a couple of albums previously, and it became like pulling teeth for Ozzy. He hadn't had a good time. And so my task, in a way, was to, fire him back up again to make another record. And I was coming right off the U2 record at the time. And I met Ozzy, and the fact that I was obviously from England and so was he, there was an immediate connection that he may not have had with a lot of the American producers, because we were able to we used to laugh about the life of Brian, or anything like that. We could say things from classic British comedy, and we would both get the joke, if you see what I mean. So we immediately had a bond through our English or Britishness, or whatever you want to call it. And it was a difficult time for Ozzy, because he decided that the band was constantly changing. It had been very much about Zakk Wylde, and Zakk had sort of left and they'd fallen out or whatever, and then he was back and then he was gone. So I was in this position of trying to make this record where I actually would love to have had Zakk all the time, but he wasn't there at the beginning. So we were gathering songs from different writers, and I was able to contribute a couple of ideas that I had conjured up at home, and Ozzy really liked them, which was a shock to me, but we ended up recording two or three of those ideas as well.
Right.
And we had Mike Bordin from Faith No More on drums, and Robert Trujillo, of course, who's in Metallica now. And the guitar player was the issue. Reeves Gabrels came in even for a few weeks and played some guitar whilst we were working on the songs. But the band, I know for sure, and I think Sharon, everybody sort of hoped that Zakk and Ozzy would figure it out, because they're a great team together. And
Yeah, so good.
Zack's a monster. I mean, there's just
Yeah.
he's insane. I mean, he would play such amazing stuff in the studio that sometimes I would just watch him and I'd have to laugh, because it was the only response that I could give, because it's just so insane what he's doing that it would take your breath away sometimes, the way he could solo on a track. But he's an interesting guy, that's for sure. And, sometimes I think I wound him up a bit too much. There's a famous interview where he basically slags me off because I used to take his guitar off him and show him what the chord that was supposed to be there was. And the only reason that I was doing that, of course, as a producer, was I'd been there when all the songs had come in, and I wanted Zakk to be aware of what the songwriter was, and Ozzy, because it's Ozzy's record, not Zakk's, what was going to happen. And Zakk took great offense to the idea that someone would touch his guitar. And of course, so Zakk was not pleased about that, apparently. But Zakk and I are mates now. We're still we're friends now. But there was a tough period in there, and it was a hard record to make. People, as always with a record, there's a lot of expectation. But it gets me through was the song that was the single, and it was the song I co-wrote, and it was just, the whole thing was just a great experience for me. To be going to make a record with Ozzy Osbourne is pretty spectacular. I can't deny it. And I really enjoyed that project.
Do you sometimes feel? I remember watching a Rick Rubin interview a while ago, and he got asked, "Are you amazed that some of these people actually exist?" Like you always said, when you're watching Zakk, you just kind of sat there in the studio. Yes, obviously, you're getting to know these people, becoming friends with these people, but you just sometimes, just like you said, just like watch in awe and listen in awe, and just think, how the hell did they fucking come up with that? How did that? How the heck are you still blown away sometimes with
Absolutely.
Come through to you?
Absolutely, you are. Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the sad things about what's happened, particularly for what I do, is that half of the job of being a mixing engineer and a producer and engineer was your ability to look at an artist in the eye, understand what they're saying, and help them be as creative as possible, work out where they're going to be most comfortable, make it work, make it all happen. And your personality was sort of part of that. you may not be very good with compression or whatever, but if you can make a guy feel good and he sings a great vocal, what's more important, right?
Yeah.
So that whole side of what we do now is sort of basically gone, or at least it has for me. And I work now with artists, and you have to make sure that you're really on the case with what you're doing musically, because you can't you haven't got them in the room with you to be able to talk things through. So you have to be able to convince them purely on the strengths of the mix or the
Yeah.
instrumentation that you're adding, because you're not there. And I miss it. I mean, half the fun was, if you're sitting with Ozzy Osbourne, getting him to tell you about when he was in, doing on this tour and that, and you hear stories, and have a cup of tea with someone like that. I mean, I can't deny it. It's insane.
Yeah.
It's all gone. It's all gone for me now. That, and I miss that. Whether it was with chatting with Planty or whoever. I mean,
Yeah.
who they are. Musicians generally have some pretty fucking funny stories. Let's face it.
Well, I'm sure you've read. I don't know if you've read Motley Crue's The Dirt or watched the Dirt film. Yeah. Just some of the stuff that Ozzy used to get up to, like in the late 70s, early 80s.
The thing about Tommy Lee was supposed to be the drummer on that album, by the way, that we did.
Oh, really?
But it didn't happen at the end. And Mike Borden did a great job. But I was sort of secretly looking forward to the idea of getting to know Tommy, because I love the outrageous side of all that stuff. But it's pretty great.
Absolutely incredible. So yeah, let's talk about him. So him again, biggest. Am I right in saying biggest band to come out of Finland, as far as like rock music goes? The response in America was absolutely fantastic, as well as the UK. And so, how did you get involved with him to start off with, and how involved were the bands with the mix process, and then obviously your friendship with Mr. Bello over the years as well? How did all that come about, and what are you up to now?
Yeah, well, we're still working on stuff now, because now the band is no longer in existence. VV, as you've seen on Spotify, as it's called.
Yeah.
And I have been working on stuff very recently. In fact, we just finished a track a few weeks back. But it's quite interesting, really, because when we started to work together remotely, we did have the experience of sitting together. So we do know each other very well, and we have worked on probably 5 or 6 albums together. So now we're remote. Wylde wanted to make sure that we were hearing things the same way. And we now both use, thanks to Genlec, we both use the 8341As as our near-field monitors, and I have my 1031s behind those.
Yep.
But
Nice.
it gave us the opportunity to be able to, when we're listening to mixes and making notes, be hearing the same thing. Wylde was it was his idea to do that, and I'm really glad that we did that, and I'm really happy with these 8341s. They've been a great addition to my room. We worked together. We started working together when we mixed an album called Love Metal. We did a few tracks in London, and then we mixed the rest of the album at Scream Studios in Los Angeles, and it was great. After mixing that, then I had the opportunity to produce for them, and I did the album Dark Light, which is the first Finnish band ever to get a gold record in America. So that was pretty great. And they were signed. I was able to sort of share my enthusiasm for the band with an A&R guy called Michael Goldston, who I knew because he was the A&R man for Pearl Jam. So he signed the band in America, and we worked together on that album. And then after that album, we did Venus Doom, which is probably my favorite album I made with him.
Yep.
And we continued on from that point, and we're still working together to this day. And it's I love working. When you find certain people, and of course it's not always going to work out. There's certain people that you're mixing for, and you just think, you know what, we don't really see this the same way. So it's fine with me. Maybe you should try somebody else, because we're not a good match.
Yeah,
it's not
sure.
always going to be a good match. And with people like Wylde, we see things in a very similar way. So it's not like pulling teeth. We're both aiming for the same end goal, and that's when it becomes really enjoyable.
Fantastic. So with Wylde, am I right in saying that I've read somewhere that he's got one of the highest male vocal ranges? If I'm right in saying that, but which is just crazy to think about his vocal range when I don't know if he's still a smoker now, but used to be famously a very, very heavy smoker.
Yeah.
and an asthmatic as well at the same time. Yet his vocal range is just
Where it goes,
it's crazy.
really low. Yeah, he's really
Yeah.
can go. I mean, on there's a song called "Sleepwalking Past Hope" off the Venus Doom album, and you get to hear the real lows in that one, and one of my favorite hymn songs. But yeah, I mean, I once again, then when we made Love Metal, it was that time. When was it? I don't know, late 90s. When was it? 2000 and I can't remember, 2000 whatever. But everyone began to make it was like, oh, we don't want to work in a recording studio with the red light and everything being so formal. We want to set up in a mansion somewhere or in a beach house and just more relaxed. That was what everyone was doing. So we joined in with that, and Wylde said, let's rent the Paramore in Los Angeles, where they'd made various Scream movies and things like that. And it was very gothic, and it was just insane being in there. And we set the drums up and brought in all the gear and built a studio and went into strange rooms here and there. And yeah, it was fun times.
So cool. And was Wylde influenced by Typo Negative? I can hear some Typo Negative influences in there.
Definitely, yeah, all those sort of bands.
Yeah, so cool. So so we're talking about with him in the 2000s, sorry, and obviously with U2 and all the bands that you're working with. So during the noughties, the transition from the noughties to now. So how did you notice that the music industry changed? I know that obviously we all know that Napster came about and LimeWire, and everyone all of a sudden they were getting the music for free. And I'm sure that I'll just tell you a little bit of a story, but I used to walk into CD shops, look at a really cool CD cover, and go to the guy at the desk, and with about 10 CDs, probably got quite annoyed by me, and basically said, can you play me 15 seconds of each CD? And that is how I discovered loads of different bands. But now, obviously, everyone's got Spotify and iTunes. And I'm sure, was it similar to you when you walked into record shops? Did you just look at a record and think, that's a cool cover, I'll check that out and see how that sounds? But what I'm trying to say to you is that do you miss that? Do you miss the actual physical vinyls and the CDs compared to where we're at now in the digital realm? Or do you think that the digital realm is a good thing?
I think as a consumer, I think Spotify and Apple Music is an insane thing to be able to have. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and it challenges the idea. I think that when we were young, we would have a record collection, and our friends would have a collection, so we would hear something at a friend's house or at a parent's house. But now, when we all have essentially the history of music on our phone, the reliance on other people introducing you to something because they have it is no longer there. It's all there for everyone. And that bears the question, if you hear a new jazz artist, for instance, and you think, okay, what would be the reason for you to possibly get into this maybe slightly subpar new artist when actually on your phone you have Ella Fitzgerald and Charlie Parker already on there? So when you're making music now, you're in much more. You're competing with the greats because they're all there. Everyone's got them. It's a weird concept in that respect. But yeah, the thing that changed most, the thing that was hard to deal with, I think, is when the music industry started to not be able to create as much income from the sale of CDs, and budgets started to get smaller. That's when it became more challenging. And there's good and bad to all of that, of course. But for me, as somebody who worked in the old school traditional studios, suddenly the labels, instead of, there was a time when you'd make a record and you would give them the money to be able to make that relationship between you and the music and the artist work, whether it was 3 days or 4, it really didn't matter. What mattered was getting the art right. And then when money became a problem, people would approach you and say, we've got a mix to do. We have, say, let's just pick a number. Say we got $3,000. We need you to get it done. Yeah. And you were then in charge as the mixer to go to a studio and call them up and say, look, I need to do this mix. How much will you give me Studio A for? And can I have the use of the AMS reverb or whatever? And you had to sort of become a used car salesman and do a bit of bartering, get the price
right,
because you were paid what was left, okay,
Sure.
at the pot, because you had to get everything done. So it was a conflict of interest in the sense of you've been working on a song, you work on it through the day, you go home, you listen to it at home and think, I just need to figure out a few more things. But if I do, and I spend another 1,000 on the studio and then the rental gear, I'll make no money. Right. So it was like, well, why would I ever do this anymore? So then the obvious answer is, okay, this is the point where I need to have my own space with my own gear in it. And then I take the fund, the budget, and I work as long as I want, and I keep it all. And if it takes me 2 days or 3 days, it really doesn't matter. That was the biggest change for me. And of course, that eventually, the first leg of that was to rent a space, put your gear in it. And I was working out of North Hollywood, and it was expensive still. I was renting a nice sound treated acoustic environment, and it was still expensive. I was paying a couple of grand a month or whatever. And to rent this space, which is a lot cheaper than obviously going to proper studios, but it was still a lot of money by the time you've multiplied it by 12. So then that eventually led to, well, I should go somewhere, move somewhere where I can build my own room in my house, and it'll be my own. And that's why I eventually moved to Texas and built my studio here. And
fantastic.
I haven't regretted it at all. One of the massive positives about working from your own room is that when we would dart around from whether it's Capitol to Larrabee to wherever, you could bring your own monitors in, but it's a whole different acoustic environment. So trying to learn a room and be confident that when you're mixing something, it's going to sound great later was always challenging. Whereas when you have your own room, once you've been in there for about 3 or 4 weeks, you don't need to start listening to things in your car because this is your room. You know it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's good and bad about it all.
So cool. So we'll have a chat about your studio in a sec, if that's okay with you, and about the environment that you're now in. So a couple of last bands to talk about, if that's okay with you, Tim. So you know that you said to me that not many people ask you about Switchfoot. Now, to me, I'm a huge Switchfoot fan, have been for a couple of decades, well, probably 15 years now. And John Foreman, as everyone knows, is a very prolific songwriter. He's got a crazy back catalogue. How did those sessions come about with the band with Switchfoot, and how involved were you with the process?
Well, that was one of the last, sort of big records that I was definitely the producer or co-producer with the band. I can't remember what it even was now, but I was, part of that whole process and loved every minute of it. I mean, those guys are fantastic. Very hardworking, and like you too, but in a very different way. It was an interesting point of my career because I was slowly getting my head around Pro Tools at that point.
Yeah,
these guys had figured out Pro Tools faster than I had, as had so many bands around that period. We were sort of dragging our feet and scratching down, hanging on to the old analog ways, whereas the bands had moved straight in. Goldfinger, John Feldman was like that, working with him. He would fire away on the Pro Tools, and I would sit and watch him, and I'd say, I don't think you need to quite edit the drums to make them quite so tight as that. He's like, no, this is the way it's got to be. They were the forefront of that whole generation, and the guys in Switchfoot were very much like that too. I'd never experienced this before. Tim, the bass player, would record a bass track, and I'd say, okay, that was great. Let's do another one. Let's try this. And he'd say, okay, and we'd do a few tracks. And then we would be, working as fast as we can. He'd say, look, can you just Dropbox me those 3 bass tracks, and I'll be in the lounge and I'll put the comp together. And I was, what? So you're gonna sit in the lounge with headphones on and put your own comp together of the bass while I carry on doing something else. Okay, well, I like that. I guess I can listen to it and check it. So he would just go off and carry on doing what he did, and we'd move on to something else. And John would, when he wanted to sing, he said, I feel really comfortable doing my vocals in this way. And I said, what way is that? He said, I really like singing in the closet in my bedroom at home. And
wow.
Okay, well, if that's where you sing the best, then that's where it would be. So he would come in with 2 or 3 vocal tracks, and I would put the comps together in the studio, but he was recording at home. And I found that artists and bands were very good like that. They figured all this shit out much quicker than the old school producers.
Yeah, that's amazing.
We worked in a studio we were in where was it? Carlsbad. It was just outside San Diego, and
Yeah.
I stayed in a hotel, and the band all lived there, and it was great. I mean, really fun. I went for a little test run where I had to work on a song. I mean, that's how serious it was. I had the opportunity, and they said, "Come down and we'll work on a song together," which is always challenging. So I had to sit with them in a room, and they said, "How would you like to approach this song?" So you have to really have your A game on and say, okay, I'd like you at the front to do this with the drums, and I want you to do this, and this is how
Yeah.
the arrangement could be. But we got on great. And an interesting thing I learned from Switchfoot, which I still do to this day if I ever am working in the songwriting part, the arrangement part of records, is we would sometimes work on a song and we'd have the basic structure, and then every so often we'd say, well, let's try the verse where the third chord is a minor, and then we say, no, let's leave that was fine as a major, let's try the last chord as a minor. And we'd always just try flipping out the major and minors in certain sections just to see if we got into a different space. And it's amazing how, obviously it's a well-known trick to anyone who writes music, but as an arranger and as a producer, sometimes you're trying to look for something else, and sometimes just switching from the major to the minor. It was always a fun thing to do when we were going through the songs, just trying them out. And it was a fun couple of months making that record. And Steve Lillywhite had recorded a couple of songs with them for that record, and I sort of mixed them and finished those off. And and he was the A&R man at the time for the band, so that was quite fun as well.
Amazing. Wasn't Steve involved with U2 as well on the same? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Steve's been involved in pretty much every U2 record. He's the finisher. He's the finisher for them. They work a lot with Brian and Dan, and then Steve comes in, and he's someone that they've trusted for all those years.
Yeah.
Somebody who represents the way things should sound, and they really, and he was, part of the All That You Can't Leave Behind, very much part. I mean, he mixed Beautiful Day, and he did a lot of the production on Walk On, and it was an amazing evening. Let me say that. At the end of recording, we'd take a break for dinner because we had a chef that would prepare dinner for us. And at that table, it was a round table, which is funny, right? So we got a round table, and you got, Steve Lillywhite, The Edge, Bono, Jimmy Iovine, Daniel Lanois, Mike Hedges, myself, all just having this dinner and talking about music. It's quite interesting, I must say.
Surreal, absolutely surreal. So cool. And John Feldman, you mentioned about John Feldman as well. It's like he's become a huge producer now and done some crazy bands. So I know that you said you were, I know I've not mentioned this yet, but you were a fan of punk back in the 70s. Are you enjoying some of the punk bands that are now coming out presently as well, or is it a completely different style of punk, do you feel, that is now aroused? I suppose it's transitioned into pop punk now, hasn't it, more, I suppose, but there's still some really, really cool. Is there any cool punk bands that you're into at the minute?
Not really. I never really liked it.
No. Fair enough.
I think it's quite trite, a lot of it, and formulaized and so edited, and it's just horrible, I think, most of it, to be honest. But I remember when we made the Goldfinger record, John, I said, because I grew up on all that stuff, so I brought all my singles into the studio and I put them all over the walls, all the original recordings of all my singles, because I still have them in the picture sleeve bags and everything. I'm still John and I, we see each other quite often, and he maintains that Stomping Ground, which is the album I did, is his favorite sounding one, which is probably just bullshit. Americans.
Honesty.
Yeah, he's great.
Fantastic. So you've recently, the last couple of years, you've worked with some really diverse artists. Obviously, your back catalogue over the last 40 years is phenomenal, but you worked recently over the last couple of years with Tin Machine, with Jeff Goldblum, with also the Psychedelic Furs as well, that I know a new single got released about a week ago. There's a few people there, but how did it how did the projects come about with Tim and Jeff and the psychedelic? First, tell us a little bit about those projects.
Well, they all come from all over the fucking place. It's just, I mean,
Yeah.
I bet you didn't know I mixed half the Cliff Richard album as well that came out.
I saw that in your discography, actually. Yeah, and again, surreal.
I was really happy that Cliff made it into the top 10 because with Cliff's record in 2021, or I guess no, it's 2020 that was, right? So that meant that I've had a top 10 album in the UK for 5 decades now. So that was nice. Brilliant. But yeah, I mean, they come from all different places. I mean, Psychedelic Furs project came because I'm friends with Richard Fortus, who's the guitar player in Guns N' Roses. And I'm friends with him because he was a big Mission fan. He loves the Mission. And he grew up on all that. I mean, he's an incredible player. And he grew up on listening to things like the Mish. So we became friends on Facebook first. And then my wife's a big Guns N' Roses fan. So I was able to then get good seats for Guns N' Roses.
Amazing.
I'm really good friends ever since then. And he was also in a band called Love Spit Love with Richard Butler after the Furs. So when it came to producing, they got Fortis to do it. And of course, Fortis reached out to me. So that's how that one came about. They all come from different ways. I mean, it's funny. I do a lot of work. One of the people that my manager, Sandy Robertson, manages is a very renowned producer called Larry Klein. He's won Producer of the Year at the Grammys. He's worked with everyone from Joni Mitchell to Herbie Hancock. I mean, he works with jazz, primarily with jazz. And fortunately for me, he asked me to mix a lot of his work. So in the last, maybe 7 or 8 years, I've worked with Larry so many times. And I love working with Larry because he works with great players. He's a great player himself, great arranger. And when I get stuff to mix with him, it's like a different type of work to what I'm used to working. It's very much organic and it requires a different sort of thinking space. And because of Larry, I mean, I've worked with Billy Childs. We did a Grammy-nominated album with him. I've worked with Melody Gardot, Carla Bruni, Andra Day, all these great vocalists. And, it's just been a wonderful opportunity. We did a tribute record to Charlie Parker. We did a tribute to Jacques Brel. We've done all sorts of things. So that opened up a whole different area of work. And the Cliff Richard was for Larry because Larry produced that. Austin, I've worked in Austin. I work with a lot of local bands here now. There's a guitar player called Eric Tessema, and I just done a song with him and Nancy Wilson from Heart, which is that's coming out on her solo album soon. And
great
with an Austin artist called Jackie Venson, who's just won Austin Album of the Year, and she's Guitar Player of the Year, and she's just an incredible guitar player and singer-songwriter. I've worked with her a lot here. Tim Minchin came via the producer. Daniel Denham is someone that I've met and worked with for a few years now. And he was producing Tim, and so I ended up mixing 3 or 4 songs on that. So they all come from all these different...
sure.
I've done a lot of remixing for an artist called Beauty and Chaos, and Wayne from the Mission's involved in that. Different people like Ashton Knight and all sorts of different people have worked on Beauty and Chaos, and I do a lot of remixes for them. So all sorts of stuff. And to be honest, I'm just happy that I can keep doing what I love to do,
Fantastic. How many hours do you actually work in the studio in a day with all these different projects going on?
Well, I'm slow. I'm much slower than I ever was. Sometimes I can actually spend 3 days mixing a song now. I think a lot of that is, as well as that mixing now has changed. Mixing used to be being very true to what had been recorded. People had spent hours, months with producers getting something the way it was. And you don't just barge your way in and start changing everything up.
Sure.
So you sort of had a lot more thought process about keeping it true to what they were doing. Whereas now, a lot of artists have had about 15 minutes to get the track down. They ran out of money and they did the best they could. So at the mix now, I find that 75% of the work I do what I describe as predixing, right? Which is a mixture of mixing and production.
Predixing. I've not heard that one before.
Yeah, I just made it up. And I'll say, okay, well, the guitar's great. Let me double it with a dirty guitar in the second verse. Right, that's done. I need to add some percussion. The vocals are out of time here. The guitar's weird here. Let's replace that. Let's do this and really get into it. and take the level really up from what they send you, and they appreciate that. Of course, they can always say no thanks. Any artist is very, if I do something and add something, they can say we don't like that new string part you added, but at least I've given them the option, right? They've heard it now.
Yeah, sure.
They can choose. So I find that most mixing is like that these days.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tim. So you mentioned, so we were talking about when your journey first started in the 80s. You were on the huge mix consoles, Utopia and all the other studios that you're working at as well when you moved over to LA. And then you transitioned from tape and analog to Pro Tools. And so how did you find that process, and how did it change your workflow?
Well, it changed everything, and I hated it at the beginning. I hated it. I did not.
Oh, no way.
I did not want to. I remember going to Westlake. I went to Westlake Audio one day for a demonstration of, I think it was Sonic Solutions, which was the before it became Pro Tools the way it is. And the guy showed it to me, and he said, you can see the audio. And I said to him, I don't want to see the audio. Why would I want to see the audio? I don't want to see the waveforms. And he played it, and I didn't think it sounded that great. And I thought, no. And he said, what do you think? I said, I think it's not for me. Thanks very much. So I walked away from that and thought, right, I'm sticking with the 2-inch and the way things are. And then as things started to change, and I realized that Pro Tools was becoming the thing, I figured at some point that if I didn't figure out how to work Pro Tools, I probably wouldn't have a career. And I think I was right in that assumption. So I basically put down the money, bought the rig, set it up in my dining room at the house, got somebody to come around and show me a few bits and bobs and how to make it work.
Yep.
Got into it. And as I said, doing the Goldfinger record helped me. The Ozzy record was one of the first records I did on Pro Tools. And I just had to get my head around it. And as I did get my head around it and work with it, I realized just what an insanely powerful and incredible tool it is. Sure. And with the sort of quality and the way things are recorded now, you need it.
Yeah.
You couldn't mix the stuff that I get given now, make it sound good without Pro Tools, because I'm getting into the performances, I'm getting into the arrangements, and I need to be able to contribute to these things fast,
Absolutely.
To do a mix, the idea of, I think I like to put a little guitar on this. Okay, can you set me up a mic? Can you rent me a guitar? Can you rent a guitar amp? Can you set it up? I mean, it would take too long. And the idea of, wow, I think the groove in that first verse is just far superior. It may be out of time, but it's far superior to the second verse. We'll just have to leave it, right? And carry on mixing. Yeah. Nowadays, you'd be like, well, fuck that. I'll take the track and I'm going to move that, because I don't know if they've realized it, but it feels so much better here. So that's done. Was that take you 25 seconds? Apple C, Apple V, move it around. Thank you very much. Or somebody's playing a guitar solo. I did a guitar solo the other day, and I was mixing it, thinking, I don't know what it is, but it sounds all right. And then I looked at it and I thought, you know what? It's actually wrong in the timing, pretty much every note. So once I nudged every note back or forward, then I listened to it at the end. I thought, there it is. Now it sits in the track. It couldn't get it to sit in the track. Now it's in the pocket. It works. And of course, can you imagine trying to do that on an analog machine? You just couldn't do it.
No.
Guess what? You'd have to be able to play it properly, and nobody could do that anyway. So, it's an incredible thing. And I've said this many times, and you've probably seen me say it. But one thing to remember, though, is to always remember that people, once it's left your domain or where you work, no one's going to see it anymore. You're the only one seeing it. So switch off your computer monitor and just listen, because all that energy that's going to your eyes goes to your ears, and you hear things in such a different way when you don't have the visual. And I think as a mixing engineer, taking breaks and just listening without the monitor are invaluable.
So I love that. I'm a beginner transitioning into intermediate as a mastering engineer. So that's my thing. I think my mentor, a guy called Tony Mance, and so Tony's been mentoring me from Melbourne for the past few weeks. very, very graciously and kindly. I've got to know him really well now. And he said something very similar to like what you said. What I'm trying to say to you is that, as you said, stop looking at all the meters, stop looking at all the information in front of your eyes. And like you said, use your ears. And I'm just learning just to kind of, like you said, just to take that in and just listen to the music rather than thinking, oh, that's I don't know, -9 LUFS. And they're going, oh no, I need to make sure I'm, within -14 LUFS and panic about that situation. But like you said, as long as it sounds right, am I right in saying that? As long as it sounds right, then you're all good to go.
I think so. I think, one of the blessings that I have had by mistake are two things. One is that, starting to work in a studio without technical training.
Yeah.
If you start asking me technical stuff, I'm going to come really unstuck.
Sure.
And I know how to make things work, but I couldn't tell you why. And I think not knowing too much about how things work just allows you to just solely concentrate on whether you like it or not. So if I play around with things, I don't really give a fuck, quite frankly, if something was overloading or whatever. But if it was great, then it's great. And the same applies with music. If you know too much about music, I think some people can tend to say, oh, you can't play that note over that flat note because it causes. And I'd be like, well, I like it. I don't know. It sounds great. It sounds good. So why can't I? And I think, no limitations because I've never had any musical training, and no limitations because I've never had any technical training have actually been useful because I literally hear music as a music listener. And if I like it, I don't really question it much further than that.
Fantastic. So good. As I know, we've one of our guests coming up towards the end of the month, Bob Katz. It fascinates me how deep he gets into it, but then he always says that he always comes back to the word color. I love the word. I don't know about you, but I love the word color. And so every human being has got a different pair of ears. So, what I'm starting to learn from people like you, from people like Steve B, and all our other guests that we've had is that everyone hears music differently. Everyone's got a different perception, which is absolutely fascinating. But what really fascinates me, what you've just said, Tim, is the fact that with all the ins and outs and kind of all the techie stuff, like you said, you're just listening and getting the results for your artist, and that is phenomenal. And that's, I think that it's very easy for a beginner to get really bogged down with looking at all kind of the ins and outs of how things work. As you said, just hit the record button or hit the compressor or the EQ, just play around with it until it sounds how you want it to sound. Whatever. Be right in saying that?
Yeah, I think for me as a producer, it's always been more about, obviously, we could talk about this forever. The song is the most important thing, and you're working, and that is your boss. The song is your boss. The song is telling you what needs to be done. And for me, a lot of people will sort of get into the nuts and bolts of whether I'm using a tube amplifier or whether I'm using these string, and I couldn't give a fuck, quite frankly. What I'm interested in is the emotional space that something takes up. In other words, if you're trying to make something angry, is it angry with the distortion from a big muff, or is it angry from a distressor being overloaded? I don't really care, as long as it's angry, right? As long as what I'm trying to emotionally tell the story of is working. And how you get there can be many ways, right? So and that's how I've always felt about guitars as well. To me, they're tools to get to an end point. It doesn't mean like, oh no, I would never use a Telecaster. It's like, I don't give a fuck what guitar it is. You plug it in, you turn it around until it's doing what you want it to do, and you play to the sound. I mean, so many people don't. They just sort of play, and you think, well, that sound doesn't work the way you're playing it. Learn to play with the sound that's there, But I know we could talk forever about this stuff.
Absolutely. Very quick though, Tim. Those amazing guitars behind you. Were talking to Luke, one of our moderators, myself, before you came on live about the stories behind each of those guitars. Feel free to tell our viewers where all these different guitars have come from behind you.
I mean, I've been very blessed to be given a lot of these guitars from people I've worked with. So I've never really had to go out and buy too many. There's all sorts of different guitars on the wall. I don't know if you can see the when I worked with U2, they used to play on things like the David Letterman show, and they did the Grammys, and we even went to the Oscars once. I could
Wow.
tell you really funny stories about that. And I was doing all this, and I did it because I loved to be with the band. I just loved the whole thing. So I was never charging
Sure.
them. I was never charging them to do that. I mean, if somebody said to you, "Do you want to go to New York with U2 and do the live sound for the Letterman show?" the money was not really, it was just so after doing maybe 10 of these for Christmas one year, The Edge sent me over that Telecaster,
Amazing.
which is, just
stunning.
Special to me to have that. And
yeah,
the stories for all of them, I don't want to go on.
Absolutely. That's so good. No, thank you so much.
Members of the silver ones from the Goo Goo Dolls, and the Les Paul was from when I worked with David Bowie, and it's just I've been very, very blessed.
Fantastic. Just really quick, thanks so much for that, Tim. With the amps as well that you use, I know that you said you are using a Kemper. Is that the main way that you tend to work with amps these days?
It's the only way I work. The Kemper is just to my right here. And as you know, you can get through like 200-300 sounds in seconds. The Kemper is rooted to my Pro Tools system. As soon as I even think of an idea, like I'd like to, double that high guitar part with a Led Zeppelin tremolo, bang, twist it in, get a guitar off the wall, chuck it on, put it in time. Thank you very much, and it's done. And there's no fucking messing around,
Love that. So cool. Yeah, and so that leads us on neatly to are you working mainly in the box, or are you working hybrid at the minute? Do you have some outboard pieces that you use? How do you tend to work?
It is technically a hybrid system. I come out of the Pro Tools 192s.
Yep.
Everything comes out. I've got 24 channels output of analog. So I send the signals to various different analog channels, analog tone lux. The tone lux system is very similar to API. It sounds lovely. And I think it enhances the sound. So I send different, like drums, maybe the toms might come out of 3 and 4. The cymbals might come out of another 2. So I have some EQ, analog EQ, although I don't do too much of that now. Then the 24 channels are summed together through a tone lux summing. And then through an SSL compressor, a rack mounted one, and a GML, George Massenburg, which I can fine tune a little bit of the highs that I like and a little bit of the lows. Nice. And then that all comes into my stereo bus, and inside the Pro Tools I have even more on the stereo bus as well, so according to each project. So it's a hybrid, and it's great. Works perfectly for me.
Fantastic. Any plugins that you like using at the minute, or is it do you just play around and just dig in whenever you feel it's right?
There's so many fucking plugins, you could lose your mind. We used to walk into a studio, and the first thing you do is you look in the racks. So you'd say, okay, well, we've got, I was talking to Chris Sheldon about this the other day. You'd look at the rack and you'd say, we've got 2 compressors. Okay, well, maybe we'll have some compression on the vocal, and maybe we'll have some compression on the bass. And that was it. You were done, right? So now, of course, you can have like 8 compressors on every fucking channel if you desire. So what was interesting is you'd walk into a room and you'd use that stuff and make something out of it. Now we have way too many choices, but I do love plugins. I think they're very very much an important part of how we mix these days. I love there's a company called Goodhertz that makes something called the Wolf compressor. I love the compressor. Right. I love DUI, their bundle. I love the DAD tape. I use that on pretty much everything to do with high end. It always has an analog simulator. I love baby audio stuff, very simple, very colorful stuff. I love there's a thing called Cush Audio, where they sort of modeled a sort of EMI RS-124. It's like a big compressor and it's beautiful. That's a great thing. I love Echo Boy, all the sound toys. I mean, and I love most of the reverbs I use are from the Capitol, the Universal Audio, like Capitol Studios and the old plates and stuff like that. So, I mean, you've basically got everything you need now. It's shocking.
Absolutely.
So, I don't know, just loads.
So good. I remember going to one of my friends. He's got a studio in Cheshire called Oscillate Recordings, and my mate Chris. And literally, I remember just he was helping me train up a couple of years ago. As I've been out of the music game for a while, and I was literally loaded up my laptop with the plugin alliance stuff, and he just literally looked at all the plugins and went, "Yep, you're fine," and closed my laptop, and we carried on. Because, as you said, the amount of plugins, you just need a few, and then you're all good to go. It's fantastic.
True. I mean, Fab Filter, that EQ is just the best. I love that Fab Filter.
Oh, Fab Filter's great.
Yeah, there's just more than we need. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much. Yes, I know that you talked briefly about your speakers. So what speakers and headphones do you like at the minute?
Yeah, I did a thing about two or 3 days ago for Genelec about they were doing a thing about everyone's den and about their mix rooms, and I talked about having these 1031As, the powered monitors, which I've had for a long time, and I asked him, I said, if I give you the serial number, will you be able to work out how old they are? And anyway, he said, no, you just got to open up the back and it'll have the inspection date. So these speakers are 30 years old now. And I had them in a flight case, and I had them shipped over to LA and back, and they've been amazing. And I still, that is my reference, my Genelec 1031As. And I've, since working with Wylde and Genelec coming involved, I supplemented all that with the 8341As, which are these smaller ones. So I sit between, I've got, the smaller near fields and the 1031As behind me, and some headphones. I've got these, what is this? The Beyer DT 770s. They sound great. And I'm good to go.
Fantastic. Do you think that maybe some kids that start off, because I know that a lot of people, they, especially starting off now with technology, like you said, there's so much technology available, and a kid now can get a laptop that just starts uni with a pair of headphones and something like the beginner version of Pro Tools or Reaper or something along those lines. Do you think it's possible for a kid to maybe learn on their headphones to start off with, and then obviously work in larger studios at a later point on speakers? Because I suppose a lot of kids, they don't have the luxury like you've done over the years of having these fantastic rooms with amazing acoustics. So any tips for any people starting out with audio or going into I don't know, starting to go into the intermediate world as well?
Well, I think that it's what you're used to ultimately. If you start off and you have a good pair of headphones or a decent pair of headphones, and you are aware of how those headphones sound by listening to some of your favorite songs, and you get to know how the low end works, and you get to know how the high end should sound in those headphones, providing they're a decent headphone, there's no reason that you can't make that work. The only reason I've had these is I've had them 30 years. It could have been anything else. It could have been some KRKs. Who knows? It's a reference point, right? And that's all we're looking for. So yes,
absolutely.
And I think, starting out, just remember what you're trying to do. You are trying to make a piece of music, whether it's a piece of jazz music or a pop song. You're trying to make that song as successful as it can be, and you are doing everything you can to make that work. Whether it's a raise in the chorus, just always keep an open mind. There's more than one way of doing things. You've got to have belief in yourself. Sometimes some of the decisions I've made have been, I think, wow, you must have had the confidence, but I wasn't necessarily that confident. I just took a gamble and went for it. And you have to be prepared to do that sometimes when you're working with people's music, is to be able to say to them, look, I think that's not right. I think this could be better, and hopefully it'll work out for you. But be open and minded and enjoy it, and and use social media as much as you can to promote what you do, which is sort of what you do with the group. It's amazing how connected we all are. Even this week, I heard from people that I haven't heard from in years. I heard from two people. I heard from the guy from the Ned's Atomic Dustbin, John Penny, the singer, and I heard from Charlene Spiteri from Texas, all through Instagram. So we're all connected. So use those connections as much as you can.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. That's great. And yes, I suppose this leads us on to our last section. So what's next on your journey? What you're planning for the future? So we've just celebrated some of your work over the last 40 years. Where's next in the Tim Palmer story? Where are you thinking your journey can go now?
Well, I think that I would like to just be able to continue mixing different types of music, and there's no pressure on me in terms of I'm not a young guy just starting out, so I try and mix stuff that I enjoy, that I have a relationship that works well with the artist, and just keep doing what I love to do. That's all I could ever want to do. As I get older, I'll probably do it less and less, but at the minute I still love doing it. And when I'm sent a project, I really get excited about doing it, and I probably work a bit too much actually, but yeah, I still love it, you know.
Mm. That's amazing. And the fact that you love music so much and you're still so passionate about what you do 40 years later, it's phenomenal. And I think that just gives so much hope for people that are just starting out in music. The fact that, they can do this for the next 30, 40, 50 years, especially with technology now. If they want to, they can, even if they're just hobbyists, that they can still do it. Or, like I mentioned this to Steve B as well, that who are we to say who the next Grammy winner is going to be? Who are we to say,
Right.
who's that going to be? And I know that you work with the Grammy guys. Is that right at the minute?
I'm currently serving as a national trustee to the Recording Academy.
Fantastic.
Finishing up my second term. And yeah, I'm very involved. Not necessarily because I love awards going to pieces of music, but because of what they do for advocacy to try and get us paid better, get credits on records, get credits on Spotify. And in America, with the healthcare system the way it is, music really provides for musicians in their time of need. So I do a lot to help with that, and that is something that I do love doing. And when you were asking earlier, I probably should have said that, but that is something, advocacy, getting involved with non-profits in Austin. You can make a big difference here, and I really like it. But yeah, 40 years is weird. Something that I thought about the other day, which will make you laugh, is when I started the studio, there was an engineer who basically taught most of the staff called John Maxwith, brilliant engineer, very technical, and he'd worked with the Dave Clark Five, for instance, in the 60s, many others. But, to us, it was like, fucking hell, that guy's worked with someone from the Dave Clark Five in the 60s. How old is he? And the weird thing is that when I work with an artist now, I can reference songs that were 40 years ago. And I just think they must think I'm so fucking old. So it's like if I walked into a session today as an artist and said, you should work with this guy, Tim Palmer. He worked with Vera Lynn or the Glenn Miller Orchestra. That would be the equivalent of what I met, when I started out on day one in 1980. But my day one would be 40 years before, which 40 years before 1980 is definitely Vera Lynn, the Andrews Sisters, you name it.
What was your process when mixing Edge's guitar tone? Was there anything? How did you approach mixing the Edge, or how did you approach recording him?
Well, it depends. I don't think there is a process really. I mean, the main part of the Edge sound is the sound that he creates at the amp with his pedals himself. And then, of course, whoever's in charge of recording that is capturing what's coming through his amplifiers. So that's a big part of the process. As far as mixing, I mean, it really does depend on like I keep going back to it, but the song, whether you need the Edge's guitar part to be cutting through more because there's a space between where Bono is at that point and where the chorus is. So at that point, I'm going to brighten the Edge up. And other times you might want him to sit back a little more. It is all very determined by the song and the arrangement. And there's no real rocket science to it. I mean, how it should be when you're there, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Tim. Right, okay. So I think that neatly wraps everything up. Any last words to our community, Tim? Anything you want to say to anyone?
No, just thank you very much for letting me be part of this, and everyone keep enjoying mixing and making music.